Chapter 19 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 19. 1805 to 1806. Marriage of Eugène. The letter which Napoleon wrote to Josephine from Vienna on the 16th of November, 1805, is interesting as showing how, in the midst of an arduous campaign, he thought of the smallest details of his wife's comfort and pleasure. To the Empress at Strasbourg, Vienna, 16 November, 1805. I am writing Monsieur d'Harville that you are to set out for Munich, stopping at Baden and Stuttgart. At Stuttgart you will give the wedding present to the Princess Paul. 15 or 20,000 francs will be enough to pay. With the balance you can make presents at Munich to the daughters of the Elector of Bavaria. Be kind, but receive all the homages. They owe you everything, but you owe them only kindness. The Electress of Würtemberg is a daughter of the King of England. She is a good woman, and you should treat her well, but without affection. I shall be very glad to see you the moment my affairs permit. I am leaving for the front. The weather is frightful. It snows all the time. For the rest all goes well. Adieu, ma bonne amie. Napoleon. As soon as she received the permission of the Emperor, Josephine made haste to start. At an early hour on the 28th of November, with her suite, she left Strasbourg amidst the cheers of the populace and the thunders of the cannon of the fortress. On her arrival at Karlsruhe the same evening, she was received with salvos of artillery. The château was illuminated, and the Margrave was at the door to welcome her with his entire court. That evening there was a banquet, followed by a ball. 2 days later she left for Stuttgart, where she was received with the same honors. On the 3rd December she continued her journey to Munich. All along the route she passed under triumphal arches, and was welcomed with salutes. At Ulm, Marshal Augereau, who was in command, had arranged a parade, and a splendid fête for the evening, but the Empress had overtaxed her strength, and was obliged to retire with a headache. Passing through Augsburg, she finally reached Munich, where she found awaiting her, at the gates of the city, the court carriages celebrated as chefs d'oeuvre of painting and sculpture. From the date of her arrival on the 5th of December until the last day of the month she was alone. The time passed quickly in a succession of entertainments of every kind, and Josephine had scarcely a moment to herself. While the Empress was on her way to Munich, Napoleon had won the great victory of Austerlitz, and finished his most brilliant campaign. His affectionate interest in Josephine is displayed in the 3 letters which he sent her from the field of battle. To the Empress at Munich. Austerlitz, 3 December, 1805. I have beaten the Russian and Austrian armies commanded by the 2 emperors. I am somewhat fatigued. I have bivouacked a week in the open air, and the nights have been quite cold. To-night I sleep in the château of Prince Kaunitz. The Russian army is not only defeated, but destroyed. I embrace thee. Napoleon. Austerlitz, 5 December. I have concluded a truce. The Russians are going back. The battle of Austerlitz is the finest that I have ever fought. 45 flags, more than 150 cannon, the standards of the Russian Guard, 20 generals, 30,000 prisoners, more than 20,000 killed, a horrible sight. The Emperor Alexander is in despair, and has set out for Russia. I met the Emperor of Germany yesterday at my bivouac, and talked with him for 2 hours. We have agreed to make peace quickly. I am looking forward with great pleasure to the moment that I can join thee. Adieu, ma bonne amie. I am quite well, and I long to embrace thee. Napoleon. Austerlitz, 7 December. I have concluded an armistice. In a week peace will be made. I am anxious to know if you reached Munich in good health. Adieu, mon ami. I long to see thee again. Napoleon. But Josephine was no more prompt in answering his letters than during the campaign of Italy, and a few days later Napoleon wrote again. To the Empress at Munich. Brunn, 10 December. It is a long time since I have received any news of thee. Have the fine fête of Baden, Stuttgart, and Munich made thee forget the poor soldiers covered with mud, drenched with rain and blood? I leave soon for Vienna. We are working to conclude peace. I long to be near thee. Adieu, mon ami. Napoleon, The silence of Josephine still continued, and Napoleon addressed her once more in a tone of wounded pleasantry. Vienna, 19 December. Great Empress! Not a letter from you since your departure from Strasbourg. You have visited Baden, Stuttgart, and Munich without writing us a word. That is neither kind nor affectionate. Deign, from the height of your grandeurs, to bestow a thought upon your slaves. Napoleon. The profound egoisme of Josephine, and the affectionate kindness of Napoleon, were never displayed more clearly than during this separation of 3 months. While the Emperor was risking his life and his fortunes on the snow-bound plains of Moravia, Josephine was amusing herself like a debutante at the brilliant courts of the South German princes, without a thought for any one but herself. By her indifference and her infidelities she had long since killed the early passionate devotion of her husband, and the day was not far distant when reasons of state would force him to stifle the feelings of tender affection which still bound him to Josephine and reluctantly decide upon a divorce. Finally, Josephine finds time to write, and pleads illness as the reason for her silence. Napoleon immediately replies in a tone of tender solicitude. To the Empress at Munich. Schönbrunn, Vienna, 20th December. I have just received your letter of the 25 Frimaire, 16 December. I am worried to learn that you are indisposed. It is not well to travel 100 leagues at this season. I do not know what I shall do. It all depends on events. I have no volition. I await the issue. Remain at Munich. Have a good time. It is not difficult amidst such society, and in so fine a country. I am myself quite busy. In several days I shall have reached a decision. Adieu, mon ami. 1,000 loving thoughts. Napoleon. On the last day of December, at 1:45 in the morning, Napoleon entered Munich under a triumphal arch. The following day the Elector was proclaimed King of Bavaria. The Treaty of Presburg, signed on the 26th December, gave to Bavaria, Würtemberg, and Baden considerable increases of territory, also to the 2 electors the title of king, and Napoleon had determined that these aggrandizements should be paid for by 3 marriages: that of his stepson Eugene with the Princess Augusta of Bavaria, that of Prince Charles of Baden with Josephine's cousin, Stephanie de Beauharnais, and finally that of his brother Jérôme with the Princess Catherine of Würtemberg. Augusta was the only daughter of Maximilian, the new King of Bavaria, by his first wife. After her death he had married Caroline, the sister of Charles of Baden, to whom Augusta was now betrothed. The Wittelsbach family, one of the oldest and most distinguished in Europe, had ruled in Bavaria for 8 centuries. But Maximilian had become Elector only a few years before, upon the extinction of the senior ruling lines of the family. Belonging to the cadet branch, and having no fortune in his youth before the Revolution, he had served in the French army, and commanded the regiment of Alsace. The happiest days of his life had been passed in France, and he was very French in his sympathies. During the Austrian war his troops had fought with the Grand Army, and the Emperor now repaid his loyalty by raising him to the royal dignity. The Margrave of Baden, then 77 years of age, had lost his only son, and his heir was his grandson Charles, a youth of 22. One of the sisters of this young prince had married Alexander, the Czar of Russia, with whom Napoleon was still at war. Another was the second wife of Maximilian, of whose daughter, Augusta, Prince Charles was himself the fiancé. Here, indeed, was a matrimonial tangle which it required all of the skill of Napoleon to unravel. For some time past the Emperor had begun to lay plans for alliances with the reigning houses of Europe. With no children of his own, 3 of his brothers already married, and Jérôme for the moment unavailable, he had been obliged to fall back on the family of Josephine. As early as the month of July, 1804, he had charged his minister in Bavaria to make inquiries about the young daughter of the Elector, and let him know if there were any projects for her marriage. At that time Napoleon's plans were all in the air, but a year later they were definitely fixed. At Boulogne, in September, 1805, he gave instructions to Monsieur de Thiard, one of his chamberlains, to proceed to Munich and open negotiations. At the very outset Thiard encountered the obstacles already mentioned. The Elector, with all his French sympathies, could not undertake lightly to offend so many powerful dames, among whom the Emperor had few friends. To break alliances already projected in order to conclude one with the Corsican adventurer was a difficult proposition. Another serious obstacle was the attachment which the young Princess Augusta had formed for her fiancé. Talleyrand, tired of seeing the negotiations drag along, and realizing the powerful effect of the Emperor's victories, now ordered Thiers to go directly to the Elector and officially demand the alliance. "The Emperor," he wrote, "has no prince of his name available. Young Beauharnais is free. Brother-in-law of an imperial prince, uncle of the one who will probably be called to the succession, stepson of the reigning Emperor, only son of the Empress, there is dignity for you." Then he drives home his argument with the words, "It is not necessary for me to analyze the consequences, and to apply them, in order to be understood by the Elector of Bavaria." It was not necessary, however, for Thiers to use these instructions, as the Elector had already reached a decision, and sent his minister to see the Emperor at Lintz, where all the arrangements were made on the 5th of November. But Napoleon was well aware that it was one thing to convince men, and quite another to win women to his cause. For this he counted on Josephine. 10 days later he sent the Empress instructions to leave her brilliant court at Strasbourg and proceed to Munich. When Josephine reached Munich the first week in December, she found the young princess far from ready to carry out the agreements which her father had made for her at Lintz a month before. In spite of all the charms of Josephine, she continued to refuse to break her engagement to Charles. Affairs were in this state when Duroc arrived from Vienna on the 21st December, to present the official demand. In his letter to the Elector, the Emperor insisted that the arrangements made at Lintz should be carried out, and expressed his wish "to see the marriage celebrated at the same moment as the conclusion of the general peace, which will certainly be signed within a fortnight." On Christmas Day, the eve of the conclusion of the treaty at Pressburg, the Elector, to avoid a painful explanation, writes his daughter, "If there were a glimmer of hope, my dear Augusta, that you could ever wed Charles, I should not beg you on my knees to give him up. Still less should I insist that you give your hand to the future King of Italy, if this crown were not to be guaranteed by the powers at the conclusion of the peace, and if I were not convinced of all the good qualities of Prince Eugene, who has everything to render you happy. Reflect, dear Augusta, that a refusal will make the Emperor as much our enemy as he has been until now the friend of our house." "My very dear and tender father," Augusta replied, "I am forced to break the pledge which I have given to Prince Charles of Baden. I consent, as much as that costs me, if the repose of a dear father and happiness of a people depend upon it. But I am not willing to give my hand to Prince Eugene if peace is not concluded, and if he is not recognized as King of Italy." The Emperor had not yet informed the Viceroy of his plans, but Eugene had no doubt been notified by his mother and had raised no objections. The day after his arrival at Munich, Napoleon had a long talk with Augusta, and flattered himself that she was reconciled to the marriage. He therefore wrote Eugene that the matter was all arranged. Affairs of state urgently demanded the presence of the Emperor at Paris, and he wanted to set out as soon as the contract was signed, leaving Josephine to represent him at the wedding. But 3 days passed, and nothing was done about the contract. On the night of the 3rd, the Emperor called Duroc, and told him that the contract must be signed at noon the next day, and that it must provide for the marriage on the 15th. Accordingly the papers were signed. At the same time the Emperor wrote Eugene to make haste to arrive as soon as possible so as to be certain to find him at Munich. Napoleon had learned that the Queen of Bavaria was trying to delay matters, with the idea of breaking off the marriage as soon as he left for Paris. Augusta was doing her part by pretending a sudden indisposition, but was quickly cured when the Emperor sent his personal physician to see her. Napoleon made up his mind that it was necessary for him to remain at Munich until after the ceremony. In the meantime he left nothing undone to remove the petty obstacles to the marriage. He ordered from Paris, as a wedding present, magnificent jewels costing over 200,000 francs, and directed each of his brothers and sisters to send gifts to the value of at least 15,000 or 20,000 francs. The opposition of the Queen was the most difficult thing to overcome, for she had 2 special grievances: the execution of the Duc d'Enghien, and the breaking of the engagement with Prince Charles. Napoleon was assiduous in his attentions to the Queen, and was so devoted that he even aroused the jealousy of Josephine. The Queen was not over 30. She had beautiful eyes, a countenance full of life, and a fine figure. What woman could resist the attentions of a man as fascinating as Napoleon when he wished to please? Meanwhile Eugene had made haste. Leaving Padua on the 6th, the day he received the Emperor's letter, he crossed the mountains on the 8th, and reached Munich 2 days later. At this time Eugene was 24 years of age. Without being in any way remarkable, his face was pleasing. He was well built, with a good figure of medium height. He excelled in all physical exercises, and, like his father, was a beautiful dancer. Kind, frank, simple in his manners, without hauteur, he was affable with everybody. He had a sunny disposition, and was always gay. Napoleon was very fond of him, and treated him like a son. As soon as he saw Eugene, the Emperor ordered him to shave off his mustache, which might displease the Princess. At the time of her marriage Augusta was only 17. She was tall, well formed, with a sylph-like figure, and a countenance in which kindness was mingled with dignity. She had received an excellent education, and had a good head for affairs, as plainly appears in her letter to her father. Eugene showed all of his mother's savoir faire in his attentions to his future wife, and courted her as warmly as if their marriage were not already arranged. The fears of the young Princess soon turned to joy, and what was to have been a mariage de convenance became a real love match. The contract was signed on the 13 January in the Grand Gallery of the Royal Palace. The exact terms never became public, as the contract was not read as usual, and the copy which Napoleon sent Joseph for deposit in the archives of the Empire was afterwards withdrawn by order of the Emperor. It is known, however, that Napoleon refused absolutely to appoint Eugene King of Italy, or even to name him as heir to the throne except in case of failure of his own children, natural and legitimate. Eugene henceforth was termed by the Emperor "mon fils" instead of "mon cousin." He had the qualification of Imperial and Royal Highness. He passed the first after the Emperor, before Joseph and Louis. In the Imperial Almanac he was called the adopted son of the Emperor. After the contract was signed, Maret, the Secretary of State, performed the civil marriage, which he really was not legally qualified to do. The following day, the 14th of January, 1806, the religious ceremony was celebrated in the Royal Chapel. Thus Napoleon has forced his entrance into the family of European sovereigns by an alliance with the ancient house of Wittelsbach, which claims Charlemagne for its founder, and so, through his adopted son, becomes related to most of the reigning families. This first attempt of Napoleon as a matchmaker was a great success. Eugene and Augusta lived very happily together, and after the fall of the Empire she resisted all the entreaties of her family to abandon her husband. Their 6 children all made distinguished marriages. Eugene, the eldest son, married the Queen of Portugal, and his brother Max espoused the daughter of the Czar of Russia. Of the 4 daughters, Josephine married the Crown Prince of Sweden, Eugenie a Hohenzollern prince, Amélie the first Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro, and the youngest daughter, the Count of Würtemberg. A week after the wedding, Prince Eugene and his wife left Munich for Milan. Napoleon and Josephine were already on their way to Paris, where they arrived on the night of the 26th of January. At Paris the news of the victory of Austerlitz had been received with transports of joy. Even Madame de Rémusat, so severe, so implacable for Napoleon, in her Memoirs composed after the Restoration, wrote her husband on the 18th December, 1805, "You cannot imagine how every head is turned. Every one sings the praises of the Emperor. I was so wrought up that I think, if the Emperor had appeared at that moment, I should have thrown myself upon his neck, ready afterwards to beg pardon at his feet." The prolongation of the Emperor's stay at Munich had only served to increase the impatience of the Parisians, and had well prepared the stage for his return. The Bank of France, to celebrate the occasion, resumed specie payments. On the 4th February there was a gala performance at the Opéra. When Napoleon entered with Josephine during the second act, the performance was interrupted while the whole audience arose and cheered. Soon after his return to Paris, the Emperor carried out the second part of his scheme for alliances with the royal families of Europe. On the 8th of April, 1806, in the chapel of the Tuileries, was celebrated with great pomp the marriage of Charles of Baden and Stephanie de Beauharnais. Prince Charles, then 23 years of age, without being exactly ugly, had a very plain face. His pink and white complexion and his chubby figure gave him the appearance of a Dutch doll, and his extreme timidity contributed an air of awkwardness. But these apparent defects were only superficial. On better acquaintance one could appreciate the rare and excellent qualities of his heart, the refinement of his feelings. He had that true spirit of kindness which inspires more affection than qualities more brilliant. Stephanie, who was born in Paris on the 28th of August, 1789, was a distant cousin of Josephine's first husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais. Abandoned by her father, Comte Claude de Beauharnais, when he immigrated at the beginning of the Revolution, the child had owed her existence to the charity of friends. At the end of 1804 she was brought to Paris and placed in the school of Madame Campan, by the express orders of the Emperor, who was indignant at Josephine's treatment of her niece à la mode de Bretagne. On his return to Paris after the Austerlitz campaign, Napoleon installed the young girl in the Tuileries, and soon became very much interested in her. With her golden hair, her blue eyes, her slight form, her free ways, this girl of 16 greatly attracted the Emperor, and especially so because she showed not the slightest timidity in his presence. The first week in March she was formally adopted by the Emperor, who gave her a dot of $1.5 million on the day of her marriage, besides a magnificent collection of jewels and a trousseau selected by Josephine, which was in excellent taste and of rare elegance. This marriage, made under such auspicious circumstances, seemed to promise a happy future, but these hopes were disappointed, at least at first. Charles, on account of his timidity, failed to win the love of his wife, who was too young and too frivolous to appreciate his really fine qualities. But, as the old French proverb says, "Tout vient à point à qui sait attendre." Everything comes to him who waits. The eyes of Stephanie were finally opened, and she came to love her husband very dearly. So this union ended, as so many others begin, in perfect happiness. Their greatest trial was the loss of their 2 sons, who died soon after birth. Both of them still young, Charles and his wife had every reason to hope for another son, but it was not to be. In December, 1818, Charles died suddenly at the age of 35. This made a great change in the position of Stephanie. The previous year Charles had issued a pragmatic sanction ensuring the succession to the crown to the Counts of Hochberg, the issue of a morganatic marriage between his grandfather, the Grand Duke Charles Frederick, and the Countess Hochberg. Stephanie won the warm affections of the Grand Ducal family and of her subjects. Her death in 1860, during the Second Empire, was deeply regretted in Baden, as well as at Paris, where she was a frequent visitor. Her eldest daughter Louise married Prince Gustave de Vasa, and became the mother of the Queen of Saxony. The second, Josephine, married Prince Charles of Hohenzollern, and was the mother of the first King of Roumania, as well as that of that prince who in 1870 was the indirect cause of the Franco-German War. Prince Louis Napoleon wanted to marry the youngest daughter, but Stephanie thought that her visionary cousin was not a good match for her child, so Marie became Duchess of Hamilton instead of Empress of the French. End of chapter 19.